Hey, this is Chris Plush from CG Masters, and in this quick tutorial I'm going to teach you how to model the top of a microphone. Here's an example of the type of microphone we'll be making. So this is our goal, a round and perfectly woven wire mesh. First we're going to create all the guidelines for it, and then we're going to bend them into a spherical shape. Then we're going to automatically extrude a circle along these guidelines by converting them to curves and using a bevel shape. So let's get started by creating the guidelines. Let's add a mesh grid from top view. Go into top view, press Shift and A, and add a mesh grid from the menu. Press the T key to open up the left side toolbar, and let's expand this bottom area here so we can change the parameters of the grid that we just added. So let's change X subdivisions to 81, Y subdivisions to 1, or looks like 2 is the minimum, and let's change the radius to 4. The 81 subdivisions perfectly spaces out the vertices by 0.1 blender units. So if we zoom in, you can see that there's a vertex at every 0.1 blender units. When creating a tightly interlocking grid of wires, perfectly spacing out the vertices will be essential to make sure that they weave together correctly. And I actually counted the number of wires on my microphone too, and it looks like there's about 80 or so in each direction. But we can change this later anyway. And now let's select only the top row of vertices and press X and delete them. Now we're working with just this bottom row of vertices here. Now let's select all of the vertices by pressing the A key and go into the header of the 3D view, and in the select menu choose check or deselect. This will select every other vertex. Now we're going to add these to a vertex group called peak. To do that, in the properties window, go to the object data buttons, which is this triangle icon here, and in the vertex group section, press the plus sign. Double click on the group name and rename this to peak, and click on assign to assign the selected vertices to that vertex group. Now once we create all the guidelines for the metal mesh on top of the microphone, we're going to bend them around into a spherical shape, and after that we'll be able to select all of the peak vertices by clicking on the select button here, and then we can scale them up to create the wavy pattern the metal wires need to weave together. Now the reason we're not creating the wavy pattern right now is because we still have to bend everything into a sphere. So if we create a wavy pattern right now and then bend it all into a spherical shape, it's going to distort that wavy pattern. That's why we're going to bend all the wires first, and then we're going to create that wavy pattern. Now select all the vertices by pressing A twice until they're all highlighted. Now what we're going to do is duplicate this line of vertices all the way up 8 blender units so that we have an 8x8 grid, which is what we started with. So with those selected, press Shift and D, and then hold Control and move it up 0.1 blender units and to the right 0.1 blender units. Now the reason I moved it to the right is because I want to maintain the checker pattern. Let me show you. I'm going to press A to deselect everything, and then with the peak vertex group selected, I'm going to click on Select. And you can see the selection maintains that checker pattern because I moved that top line to the right. Alright. Now press A twice again and select all of them, and I'm going to duplicate both of these lines at the same time by pressing Shift and D, holding Control, and moving it up 0.2 blender units. And now we can automate this process all the way up by simply pressing Shift and R, which repeats the last process or the last action that we made. So press Shift and R and just keep pressing that until we get up to right there, which is 4 blender units above the x-axis. Looks like we created one extra line up there. So I'm going to select that by pressing L over that vertex and then press X to delete it. So here are our horizontal guidelines for the metal mesh on top of the microphone. Now let's create the vertical guidelines by duplicating all of these vertices and rotating them 90 degrees. So press the A key to select all the vertices, and now we're going to duplicate this and rotate this around the cursor in the center of the world. Now if the cursor is set anywhere else other than the center of the world, you can press Shift and C to recenter that. So now with all those vertices selected, let's change the pivot point in the header here from medium to 3D cursor to make sure we rotate this around the 3D cursor. Now the reason I'm rotating around the 3D cursor instead of the center of the selection is I'm not entirely sure that the center of the selection is at the center of the world. And we want to do things by the book because all these vertices have to maintain their alignment with each other once we rotate this 90 degrees. So the cursor set at the center and pivot point set to 3D cursor. Whoops. Press Shift and D, and then press R to rotate around the cursor, and hold Control to rotate it perfectly 90 degrees. Now let's zoom in and make sure that everything is still aligned. You can see that all the vertices on the vertical guidelines are aligned with the vertices on the horizontal guidelines. So that's perfect. And that's exactly what we want. Now with those vertices still selected, we're going to add a new vertex group. So press this plus sign to add a new group. Double click on the name and rename this to vertical. That is not how you spell that. Vertical. And click on assign. Now once we bend all of these guidelines into a sphere, we'll be able to separate the vertical lines from the horizontal lines, which is just going to make it a little bit easier to create that wavy pattern. Now just for the heck of it, I'm going to trim some of the excess vertices sticking out of the bottom and the right side by selecting them and pressing X and deleting those vertices. So now we have a perfect 8x8 square. Now let's get out of edit mode by pressing Tab and going into front view. Now I'll go to the modifier buttons in the properties window, which is this little wrench icon. Click on add modifier and add the cast modifier. This modifier is what we're going to use to bend these lines into a sphere. My teammate 80 suggested this, and it's definitely the fastest way to go. You could try the shrink wrap modifier, but that modifier won't maintain the structure and spacing of our guidelines. And with something like a woven wire mesh, we need this to be as perfect as possible. So in this modifier here, let's enable this icon, which allows us to see the modifier while in edit mode still. And now let's go into edit mode, select all the vertices, press G and then press Z to move it up on the Z axis. And you can see the modifier starting to distort the guidelines. So hold Control and move this up 4 Blender units. And now change the factor to 4. And that looks pretty spherical to me. Don't worry about the bottom half, we'll be trimming that off. But I want to make sure that this is a perfect sphere. So I'm going to get out of edit mode, and I'm going to press Shift and A and add a mesh UV sphere. I'm going to move that up on the Z axis and scale it up. Whoops, we're scaling and rotating around the 3D cursor still. So in the header here, let's change the pivot point back to median point. And press S and let's scale that up. So it looks like our guidelines were bent perfectly into a sphere with the settings we chose. And you may have to, depending on how big your grid was, you may have to play with the factor settings and moving the vertices away from the 3D cursor to get your perfectly spherical shape. Now the distortion, if you haven't figured it out already, is based on how far away from the origin the vertices are. So we've found the perfect settings, and before we apply this modifier, I'm going to press Shift and D to duplicate it, and then press M and move it to the last layer just as a backup, just in case we screw things up. I'm going to hide this sphere here. We might use that later on, so no sense in deleting it and re-adding it later. So I'm just going to hide it by pressing H. Now select our guidelines again, and back in the modifier buttons, click on the apply button in the cast modifier, which will apply all the changes that modifier made to our mesh. So if you go into edit mode, you can see that modifier is no longer affecting the object. This is actually what it looks like now. Now we want to delete the bottom half of this. So press Alt and H. Let's bring back our sphere. So here's the halfway mark on the sphere. Keep track of that and select our guideline object and go back into edit mode. Press the B key for box select and go a little bit lower than the halfway mark of the sphere and draw a line over the guideline like that, over all the guidelines like that. Now press X and delete them. Now select all the vertices, press G and then Z, and let's move that down to the center of the world so that it's just slightly overlapping that red line. Perfect. I'm going to hide this sphere again since we're done with that for now. Now go back into edit mode, press A to deselect everything, and in the object data buttons, go to the vertex groups, select the vertical vertex group, and click on select. Now press the P key to separate them into their own object. Now we have two sets of guidelines that we can work with separately to create this wavy pattern, which is our next step. So select the vertical guidelines and go into side view and go into edit mode. Make sure everything is deselected and then go into the vertex groups, select peak, and then choose select. Now we can scale these up to start creating our wavy pattern, but we want to scale it up based on where the 3D cursor is, which is the center of our sphere. So in the 3D header, change the pivot point to 3D cursor again. Now we can scale these up based on where the 3D cursor is. Let's zoom in a little, and let's scale this up by holding Control for snapping, but we want to snap to smaller increments, so hold Control and Shift. So we can scale it to 1.05. Now we're going to do the same thing with the horizontal lines. So go into front view, get out of edit mode, and select the horizontal guidelines. Go into edit mode, and with nothing selected, select the peak vertex group, and then select select. And we're going to scale these up the same way, except there's one problem. If we scale these vertices up, it's going to be exactly in line with the way we scaled the vertical guidelines. And we don't want that because that's not going to create the wavy pattern. So what we're going to do is press W and choose select inverse. Now those are definitely the vertices we want to scale up. So back in front view, zoom in a little, press S, hold Control and Shift, and scale it up to 1.05. Now let's get out of edit mode and see how it all looks. Does it look like a wavy pattern that's going to interlock with each other? Yes, it does. Alright, we created our wavy pattern in both of our sets of guidelines. Now, right click on one, hold Shift, right click on the other to select them both, press Ctrl and J to join them together into one mesh. Now, same thing we did before, we're going to duplicate this by pressing Shift and D and press the M key to move it into the last layer as a backup, just in case we screw things up. Now select our guideline object again, and now we're going to convert this into a curve by pressing Alt and C, and choose Curve from Mesh. Now if you go into edit mode, you'll see things look a little different. This is no longer a mesh object now it's just a set of curves. And because it's curves, what we're going to do now is add a curved circle, and that curve is going to be extruded along all of these paths to create our three-dimensional wires. So go into front view, press Shift and A, and add a curve circle. Go into edit mode and scale this down really small. And move that down on the Z-axis just so it's out of the way. Now select our guidelines here and go into the object data buttons, which is this little curvy line here. And here's all the different options we have for a curve object. The option that we're looking for is bevel object. Whatever object we plug into this field will be extruded along all of these paths. So naturally we're going to plug in the circle in that field. So click on that field and select Bezier circle. Press Z for shaded view, and you'll see that all of our wires are now three-dimensional and interlocking and looking awesome, but they're a little thick. So we're going to scale down this circle by going into edit mode and pressing S to scale. Whoops, first we have to turn off scaling on the 3D cursor. So go back in the 3D header and change the pivot point back to median point. And press S and scale that down to the desired thickness. Scale up a little bit more. Alright, I think that looks good. Now if you'll zoom in, you'll notice that this is a pretty detailed circle, and we're going to end up subsurfing this in the end. So I'm going to change the resolution to something much lower. So with the circle selected, in the object data buttons, let's change preview from 12 to, not 1, 12 to 2. Change that to a resolution of 2. And it looks like a pretty low poly circle, but again, we're going to be subsurfing this in the end, so we can afford to make this a lower resolution so that it's not super high resolution in the end when we do subsurf it. So let's select our microphone top here and press the T key and find out where the shading options are. Here we go. And press the smooth button to smooth shade them. And now everything's looking good, except it's jagged the way, the wavy pattern is really jagged right now. So that's where subsurf comes in. And even though it's a curve object, we can still subsurf this just like we would a mesh object. So let's go to the modifier buttons and add a modifier and select subdivision surface. And let's change view subdivisions from 1 to 2 and render subdivisions to 2. And now it's looking perfect. Alright, so that does it for the top half of this microphone piece. I'm going to change the view subdivisions back down to 0 because it's slowing down my 3D view. Now to make the bottom half, we're just going to select this and duplicate it and rotate it around 180 degrees. Now we're going to create a little metal band that goes around the center and hides this nasty seam. We're going to do that by creating the profile of the band on the right side, and then from top view, we're going to spin it around in a circle. Now to create the band, make sure that the cursor is set to the world center. Press Shift and A, and let's add a mesh plane. Now we're going to move this to the right, but we're going to do it in edit mode. We want to keep the origin point at the center of this sphere, because when we go to spin this around this sphere, it's going to take into account where the origin point is and spin it around there. So go into edit mode, select all the vertices and move them over to the right. Let's scale that down to the height we want our band to be, which we can change this later, so it doesn't really matter. And let's zoom in and select these two end vertices there, move them closer to the sphere. And press X and let's delete that edge, just the edge, so we're left with this profile. Now select these two vertices, press E to extrude them, and then press S to scale them down. Now press E to extrude them again, and press X to move them along the X-axis and move them inward. And now press F to face them, or to create an edge between the two vertices. I'm going to select all the vertices and move them in just a little bit more. And now we're going to spin this around in a circle, but we're going to be subsurfing this in the end. So there's one more thing we have to do before we spin this around. We need to add some extra vertices around each of these corners here. Because, for example, if we go and add a modifier for subsurfing, you can see that everything is smoothed out way too much. That's because we need to add extra detail where the corners are. So let's start by selecting these two vertices and subdividing that twice. Select these two vertices and scale them up until they're close to the edge like that. The closer to the corners that these vertices are, the sharper those bevels are going to be. So let's do the same thing here. Subdivide it twice. Take the two end vertices and scale them up until they're close to the corners. And now get out of edit mode, and you'll see now the corners have really sharp bevels on them. That's perfect. Now we can spin this around by adding a screw modifier. When you add that, you can see that obviously it's spun around the wrong axis. So go into top view, and let's change the axis in that modifier from Z to Y. There we go, that's perfect. But right now everything is really low resolution. So let's change the steps in that modifier from 16 to 30. Alright, let's increase it a little bit more to 32. Now apply that modifier and let's take a look at it. Well, we have all these dark artifacts, so let's go into edit mode, select all of the vertices and press Ctrl and N to recalculate the normals facing outside, and that takes care of those artifacts. And that's a good looking band, but it's a little bit big. It's a little tall and it's sticking out just a little bit too much. So I'm going to select all those vertices and scale them in. But you got to make sure that the wire mesh isn't coming through. So let's select the wire mesh here and crank up the subdivisions to 2, which is how it's going to be rendered. and see if it's still coming through the band, and it is. So select the band, scale it up to where you can't see the metal wires anymore. And that's perfect. I also think it's a little bit tall, so I'm going to go into edit mode, select the top half, and move that down. Select the bottom half, and move that up. And that's it. That's perfect. That does it for our band. I'm going to change these subdivisions back down to 0. And crank these up to 2 in the view just to get a good preview. It looks good. I'm happy with that. And the handle for this microphone is basically a circle extruded all the way down. So that really does it for this tutorial. You can handle the handle. You can handle the handle on your own. And I hope you learned something from this tutorial. And if you have any other tips for creating similar meshes, please post them in the comments.